helping people with paralysis, streaming music to the brain, telepathy. These are the wild claims made by Elon Musk and his company Neuralink regarding the brain-computer interface they are developing. But are these claims legitimate or just science fiction? Last summer, during the presentation the Neuralink made with the pigs, we saw this image presenting all the possible issues regarding the brain that the brain-computer interface that this company is developing could solve, from memory loss to brain damage. It's really a lot of issues that this device could potentially solve in the future, and you might be wondering if it is true, if just a brain-computer interface could solve all of these problems, just a bunch of electrodes implanted in the brain. It seems amazing, right? And it would be cool on its own, but in fact Neuralink and Elon Musk decided to double down on the promises and to promise also commercial applications like, for example, streaming music to the brain or telepathy, or lots of very wild claims. And while some of these claims might be a little bit exaggerated, there is actually a lot of science behind brain-computer interfaces. The company Neuralink in fact stands on the shoulders of giants, and today we talk in fact about what brain-computer interfaces can and cannot do at the moment. So let's start. Paralysis. People affected by movement disorders like, for example, a spinal cord injury or a stroke have always been interested in the possibilities offered by brain-computer interfaces. For example, when it comes to people affected by a spinal cord injury, the thing is that these people have perfectly healthy, perfectly functioning brains. It's just that the signals generated by the brains cannot be relayed to the muscles, which is why these people cannot move. So, a solution offered by brain-computer interface is that the signals generated by the brain are instead captured by the electrodes implanted in the brain, and these signals are then transduced into commands for motors, for example, to move a robotic arm. There are so many studies on this topic, on helping people affected by paralysis, that I don't want to show all of them. I just want to show some of the most recent ones, some of the most interesting ones. For example, in 2019 in France, a man was able to control with his own mind a full exoskeleton, all 4 limbs, and we're talking about a quadriplegic man, so a person not able to control both his arms and legs, and yet, thanks to a brain-computer interface, he was able to control the exoskeleton and to perform different kinds of movements. More recently, in a 2020 study, a patient was able instead to control 2 robotic arms and feed himself dessert, so to cut the dessert, this cake, and to feed himself this cake with the robotic arms, showing an incredible amount of precision and control in controlling the 2 robotic limbs, just with his thoughts. So with this foundation, we hope to see even better results with Neuralink. Neurological and mental disorders. Brain stimulation is a technique that has been used for several decades, for about 3 decades, to help people with different kinds of disorders. For example, a technique is commonly used and it is called deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is a technique where electrodes are implanted deep in the brain of a patient. So it's a different kind of technique with respect to what adopted by companies like Neuralink, where the electrodes are instead implanted on the surface of the brain, on the cortex. But with deep brain stimulation, several possibilities are open for scientists to help people with different kinds of disorders. For example, the electrical impulses that are generated by these electrodes can help to restore some malfunctioning connections between the neurons. So basically, these electrodes, they can zap the brain, and this zapping can help some functions of the brain. For example, it can help to stop the tremors that are typically associated with Parkinson's disease. It can help thus in reducing the symptoms, the condition of the Parkinson's disease, and help in improving the quality of life of the patient. But deep brain stimulation, electrode stimulation, can also be used, for example, to stop the spread of unwanted neuronal connections, which is what happens, for example, with seizures that are typical of epilepsy. But in addition to treating Parkinson's disease and epilepsy, there are other conditions that can be treated with brain stimulation. For example, mental disorders like depression and OCD, or treating chronic or extreme pain, or treating, for example, memory loss. All of these have been actually assessed in several studies with brain-computer interfaces. You can check the link in the description if you're interested. Streaming music to the brain. Yeah, this one sounds a lot like science fiction, but when it comes to brain-computer interfaces and hearing, the concept of making people hear sounds with brain-computer interface is not far-fetched. Scientists have been working in fact for years on different types of implants for people with hearing loss. For example, some of these implants are called so-called auditory cortical implants. These cortical implants are placed on the auditory cortex of a patient, and in this case they can bypass any damage, for example to the ear of a person, but also to the auditory nerve, which is the nerve that sends the information from the ear to the auditory cortex of a person. So then the auditory cortex is the area of the brain which transduces this information into sounds, which is what we call sound. So the idea with the brain-computer interface is that you place these electrodes in the auditory cortex. These electrodes, they stimulate the neurons in the auditory cortex with some electrical impulses, and people hear sounds. Currently, these devices are still under research. There are other similar devices that are called, for example, cochlear implants, which are based on a somewhat similar principle. They're not specifically on the auditory cortex, they are instead placed on the cochlea. And the thing is, when it comes to the sound quality, the sound performance, unfortunately, the sound performance is still not excellent. This is, for example, what people hear when they hear with a cochlear implant.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
And the thing is, with auditory cortical implants, so implants placed on the auditory cortex, the sound performance would probably be even worse. So Spotify in your brain will have to wait for a little bit. Superhuman vision. Yeah, once again, this is a little bit like science fiction, like for the auditory problem. But here is the thing, when it comes to blind people, when it comes to helping blind people with a brain-computer interface, this is already under study. There are some very interesting results that we can take a look at. Famous studies are, for example, from the Monash University, which is called the Genaris Bionic Vision System that they are developing, or from the Baylor College of Medicine from Houston. And in these studies, they actually developed some brain-computer interfaces that they interface directly with the visual cortex of the patient's brain. So the visual cortex is another area of the brain where the visual information is processed. So the visual information that comes from our eyes through the optical nerve, and then it reaches this area of the brain. In case a patient has damaged the eye or the optical nerve, we can directly stimulate the visual cortex of this patient. The idea is that with these brain-computer interfaces, with these devices, we have a full system with a camera. This camera can actually capture the feed, the video feed from the external environment. This video feed is converted then in some commands for the electrodes which are implanted in the visual cortex. And these commands actually stimulate the electrodes and thus stimulate the visual cortex in a specific pattern. And what happens is that they basically recreate what were called phosphines. Phosphines are the little dots of light. When you see, for example, when you rub your eyes a lot, you see these little dots of white light, which is not actually light that is coming from the external environment, it's light that is generated from your brain. So scientists thought something very interesting. They thought, what if we use these phosphines? What if we can create these phosphines in the field of vision of a patient, and then stimulating the visual cortex in a specific pattern, we can have the patients see some shapes formed by these phosphines. Very fascinating concept, and in these videos you can see in fact these blind patients being able to recognize the shapes of, for example, some letters, and to recognize these letters only by seeing these patterns of phosphines, only by brain stimulation. And these are all incredible results, but they are incredible results if you're a blind person. For healthy people, probably we have to wait a little bit for superhuman vision. Telepathy. Ooh, that's a big one, yeah. Telepathy, like in the X-Men movies, like in superhero movies, yeah, that's science fiction. But communicating with our thoughts and seeing what people are thinking is not really science fiction. Scientists have for years studied ways to help people with communication issues, a way for them to communicate back again. And one way is to help them with brain-computer interfaces. For example, in this study, in this video, we can see a study from the Stanford University which demonstrated how a Utah ray, which is a type of brain-computer interface that is also less advanced than the Neuralink brain-computer interface. A Utah ray could help a woman, this lady, moving a cursor on a keyboard just with her thoughts. So this woman was controlling the cursor and was able to type on a keyboard just with her thoughts, thus communicating with the external world. Which is really not so different from what we saw recently with a monkey, with a Neuralink monkey in the most recent video from the company. Even if we have to say the Stanford University studies from 4 years ago. But what about reading the brain? What about seeing what's inside a person's mind? Again, not so much science fiction. In a very fascinating study published 10 years ago from UC Berkeley, the scientists achieved incredible results. So patients basically were shown several movie clips, the ones that you can see on the left. And in the meantime, their brain activities were monitored with fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a technique to see brain activity. And to be honest, it's not an actual brain-computer interface. It doesn't require any surgery, any electrodes implanted. It uses some magnets to see in fact the blood flow in a person's brain, and from the blood flow you can see in fact which area of the brain is more active. So from just looking at the blood flow of the patients, they were able to see which brain areas were active, and from this they were able to see basically what people were thinking at. But just by looking at the blood flow in the brain, they were capable of achieving these amazing results, because on the right we can literally see what the patient was looking at just by reconstructing his brain activity with this kind of technique. And of course what we can see from the reconstruction of the brain activity of the patient is not very like the original, is a bit blurry, but still it was amazing to see this result obtained during the study that is 10 years old, just from reconstructing the brain activity with a technique that doesn't even require surgery. So you might wonder how much could we learn more about the brain and its functioning with a brain-computer interface so advanced like the one that Neuralink is developing. Merging man and machine. This is the big long-term objective of Neuralink and of Elon Musk, and I want to stress the long term because it's very science fiction. Here's the thing, we still don't know a lot about our brains. Neuroscientists stress this a lot of times. They stress that there is still a lot that we have to learn about our brains, our minds, and in general intelligence. It's like we're just scratching the surface of our understanding of the brains. So before moving on to our, let's say, next evolutionary step and merge human minds with a machine, maybe we have to consolidate a little bit what we know actually about our brains. Which is why, for the moment, Neuralink applications will be therapeutical, they will not be commercial, so superhuman vision or streaming music to the brain will not be the first applications probably for a while. Because there is another important aspect that we have to consider. It's not just the feasibility, it's the fact that Neuralink and other brain-computer interfaces, they require surgery. Brain surgery, and brain surgery is no joke. Despite all the experience that we have on it, it's still a very delicate and challenging operation. Very few people would choose to undergo willingly a brain surgery operation, even if not necessary. People in these studies, they have serious issues and they want to test the capabilities of a brain-computer interfaces to help them. But if you're healthy, probably you want to think twice before getting a brain surgery. Like a famous neurosurgeon once said, "You ain't never the same when the air hits your brain." So I hope I could clarify some open points regarding brain-computer interfaces and Neuralink and what is achievable or not. This is not a criticism towards the company Neuralink, it is a very promising company. I just wanted to talk about a little bit of a hype surrounding this company. So let me know in the comments what you think about these applications, and if you're interested in these videos about brain-computer interfaces, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.